Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Max Odkins. I'm with the Fire and Resource Assessment Program here at CAL FIRE. And I'm very excited to welcome you to this presentation from one of the grantees in our Forest Health Research Grant Program. We're joined today by Dr. Stephanie Jelinek from the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station for this presentation, Postfire Forest Regeneration and Understory Development in Eastside Sierra Nevada Jeffrey Pine Forests. This project is part of our Forest Health Research Program, which is funded in part by California Climate Investments. That's a program that puts cap and invest dollars to work in communities throughout California. This program, our Forest Health Research Program, aims to prioritize and fund research in forest health and fire science critical to the state of California, share scientific information, and support statewide plans, including the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please note that this presentation is being recorded, and you can find this recording as well as recordings of past webinars on our webinars and events webpage. There's a QR code for anyone who'd like to check that out. You'll be able to find this recording about a week after this presentation posted there, along with, I believe, 26 of our previous webinars from our research grantees. You can type questions into the chat at any time during the presentation, or you can raise your hand to ask a question during the Q&A session that will be at the end of the presentation. So go ahead and enter those questions at any point, and we'll make sure that we get to as many of them as we have time for at the end of the presentation. With that, I am very happy to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Stephanie Jelinek is a research scientist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station for the U.S. Forest Service based in Reno, Nevada. She is interested in plant ecosystem interactions and how these alter the trajectory of plant communities that are under diverse anthropogenic threats, including invasive species, increased wildfire, and climate change. She combines ecological theory with empirical field-based experiments to address problems that have application to habitat management and restoration. Her work in restoration ecology and invasive species impacts has spanned arid shrubland and wet forest habitats in California, Hawaii, Nevada, Utah, and South Africa. Thank you very much for being here with us today, Stephanie. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Max. I appreciate the ability to present some of the research we've been doing today. If I can share my screen. Are we on the right screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about post-fire forest regeneration and understory development in Eastside Sierra Nevada Jeffrey Pine Forests. I first want to just note that we have plenty of collaborators on this project. Allie Paulson, Taylor Saunders, Rosa Kirk Davidoff, Mark Meyer, and Ali Urza. And I will also say we're still taking data on all of our regen plots. And so this is a little bit preliminary, and we're still also playing around with some of the analyses we're thinking about. So just to say that out loud. All right. Did not advance. I don't seem to be. Okay, there we go. So fire size and severity is increasing in the Western United States, and in the Sierra Nevada specifically. Historic fire regimes were frequent around 25 years, but usually resulted in low to mid severity fires, which leaves these patchy mosaics of trees across the landscape, which is really important for how those forests regenerate after the fire. And this is in contrast to high severity fires, especially large area high severity fires, where there is no standing canopy afterwards. And so the different way that this can result in different forest regeneration has to do with, so in mid and low severity fires, when you have live adult trees, you have a seed source. You also have canopy cover, which can shade your seedlings from harsh conditions, such as high sun, high temperature, and low temperatures in the winter. Often you're left with more soil organic matter, which helps you hold soil moisture, which is great for seedling regeneration, and you have lower shrub cover because you still have competition from trees. Whereas in high severity fire, you're faced with seed limitation, these open, harsh habitats, mineral soils, which can be hydrophobic, and high shrub cover. And all of these things are classically thought to be terrible for tree regeneration. And so I spent a lot of time in my career thinking about feedbacks and ecosystem resiliency. And so when thinking about these sort of patchy mosaics within these patches of live trees, you have those seed, you have the shade, and you have some litter. And this is a positive effect on seedling regeneration, which of course has a positive effect on how many canopy trees you have over time. And it's these sort of internal reinforcements, positive feedbacks within ecosystems that create resiliency to disturbance, so that when ecosystems do get pushed in disturbance, they tend to go back to the same state. And when you leave some of these ecosystem functions behind, that's when we get pushed into a new state. And so beyond the sort of conceptual theoretical part of it all, understanding seedling recruitment and when and where this is happening on the landscape can really help us determine management. And so there's this program called Postscript, or the Postfire Conifer Reforestation Planning Tool by John Stewart and others. And this uses spatially explicit landscape scale variables and climate topography, forest composition, and fire severity to predict out where on the landscape they think they're going to see trees naturally coming in. And this is great from a management perspective because it's really good to not spend time and money and person hours planting trees where they're already going to be in existence. But one thing that's been noted about tree regeneration data, not just from the folks at Postscript, but from lots of other publications, is there's just a general lack of data from the Eastern Sierra. And if you ever take the time to look at a map of all of the universities in California on the Western Slope, you can kind of see why we've just got UNR over here and then our office. But the Eastern Sierra is a little bit different, right? So when we think about climate, we've just been sort of playing around with some climate data from GridMet, and we sort of arbitrarily split the Sierra Nevada into northern and southern regions at Lake Tahoe, and then use the Pacific Crest to separate east and west. And so what this is showing is Sierra Nevada winter precipitation by region. And so generally speaking, on the western slope, both on the south and in the north, you get slightly higher precipitation on the western slope than on the eastern slope. So we're just a little bit drier over here. And when we think about temperatures, so we have winter temperatures by region, and then summer temperatures by region as well. And this, especially I would say the winter temperatures, we tend to be a little bit colder over on the east side, and sometimes we're hotter, but this sort of comes out in the wash a little bit. And so I think this comes into play in thinking not only about trees coming in and of themselves, but the dynamics between shrubs and trees, which can change across stress gradients. So shrubs are typically seen as competitors in forested ecosystems. And data from the Western Sierra suggests that we get low tree regeneration when there's over 30% shrubs in forestry plots. However, most studies are at the scale of a 20-meter radius plot. And so you could have a shrub over there and your tree seedling over there, and they're not actually interacting. So thinking about things on more of a microplot scale, I think is important for thinking about tree-shrub relationships. Again, there is a Western bias to these studies, and the Eastern Sierra has a harsher habitat, and there's a lack of experimental studies in this to a certain extent. When we think about competition and versus facilitation between shrubs and trees, you know, if we have a tree seedling sitting under shrub, which is what this picture is meant to portray, we have both competition and facilitation always. So we're always going to see that shrub pulling water from the soil, pulling nutrients from the soil that would otherwise go to the tree. But it's also possible that the shrub is increasing nutrients in the soil and organic matter in the soil, that it's buffering it from really hot temperatures, really cold temperatures, and it's casting shade, which can lead to more soil moisture. And so it's the balance of these positive and negative interactions that really describes the fate of that tree-shrub interaction. And in really productive climates, like on the Western Slope, where your shrubs get, you know, really tall in a short span of time, we can see that these would be really competitive. But in harsher climates, it's thought that we tend to move more towards a facilitation model. So this figure is just sort of a conceptual diagram. And on the y-axis, we have interaction strength with facilitation being higher up and more competition being lower on that y-axis. And then the x-axis is sort of a stress gradient. You can think of that in terms of moisture, in terms of temperature. And in low stress or high productivity environments, more like the Western Sierra, we expect to see more of a competition framework. And in these high stress environments, we expect to see more of this facilitation coming in just due to just harsher conditions for those tree seedlings. And this figure is from 2018, but this stress gradient hypothesis, as it's called, has been around like since the 90s. And there's also evidence from the Eastern Sierra that these things are already going on. So I have a little pictorial of the ecotones in the Sierra Nevada, and I've got the red circle around the eastern slope. And sitting right below the yellow pine forest, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, is pinyon juniper woodlands, right? And so there's a lot of research that shows that pinyon trees really only come in under sagebrush due to these sort of nurse plant facilitation effects. And so it stands to reason that at just a little bit higher in elevation, we might be seeing some similar dynamics with the shrubs and the yellow pines. Okay, and the last thing I want to touch on today before I get into the questions we're going to be thinking about is just those things besides shrubs which can come in these high disturbance areas, especially when we have post-fire management going on and big equipment coming in, and that's invasions of non-native plants. And so a big concern on the eastern slope of the Sierra, because we are butting up right next to the Great Basin, is cheatgrass and annual grasses and grass fire cycles. And so Bromus tectorum, or cheatgrass, is well known to come in after fire and other disturbances to sagebrush landscapes. And you can kind of see that red-pink haze in between the sagebrush, and that's all cheatgrass. And so it increases fine fuel loads and fuel continuity in the Great Basin, and it's shown to be quite detrimental and lead to these grass fire cycles, which are self-perpetuating. And there's been a recent paper, Smith et al. 2021, which has showed that cheatgrass is increasing quite a bit in area. So an 8-fold increase between 1990 and 2020. By 2020, annual grasses dominated about a fifth of the Great Basin rangelands. But I think importantly for this talk, there's also been seen widespread movement into higher elevations in northern aspects, which is consistent with warmer climates and which puts those yellow pine areas somewhat in peril of being invaded by cheatgrass and other invasive species. And so again, here's that sort of diagram of the ecotones of the Eastern Sierra. And so at the lowest elevation, we see sagebrush, and then those pinyon juniper woodlands, and then those yellow pine forests above that. But of course, like on the landscape, we don't just see gradations and these bands of vegetation, you know, due to past land use history, due to different disturbance regimes, soil type, aspect, slope. We get these things integrating with each other all of the time. And so this is not from the Sierra Nevada, but, you know, here's a picture of pinyon juniper coming into sagebrush ecosystems. In those PJ woodlands, we can see some sagebrush in between the pinyon and juniper trees. And then finally, in our yellow pine forest, it's not uncommon to see sagebrush sitting right below our yellow pines in the Eastern Sierra. And so it stands to reason that some of these invasive species could easily move up from one ecotone to the next. So the specific questions I'm going to address today, and thank you to CAL FIRE for this funding for this project, is I think most importantly, under what conditions do we see yellow pines regenerating after fire, specifically in the Eastern Sierra? What role do shrubs play in post-fire tree regeneration? And then sort of an add-on, because we had understory plot level data, we wanted to ask whether or not we were seeing invasions, and specifically cheatgrass invasion after fire in the Eastern Sierra. And so I've got a map of some of the fires that we've been working in. What do I want to say about this? Some of the more southern fires in the Inyo National Forest, we've been working with data that we did not take, but that Mark Meyer, one of our collaborators, has been taking over time. So we are adding in his data to ours as well. And so when we look at the fire severity in the yellow pine zone, this is just to show the different severity levels, specifically in the yellow pine zone, the proportion of area that burned at those different fire severities. So unchanged, low severity fire, moderate fire, and high severity fire. And so across these different fires that we're working in, and this isn't the full suite of the fires, this is just the data that we've spatially worked up so far, just to show that there is a lot of high severity area out there. And so to answer this first question, under what conditions do we see yellow pines regenerating after fire? We have a series of forestry plots across these fires. They tend to be 20-meter radius plots, although they are variable radius if we don't find enough seedlings. We have a suite of abiotic variables that we're pulling off of GIS and taking in the plots. Slope aspect, certain post-fire climate variables such as climate water deficit, heat load. We have elevation, fire severity, and we're also looking at post-fire temperatures as things that are abiotic variables that can affect tree regeneration. And so then some of the biotic variables we'll be thinking about, that we have been thinking about, are the percent cover of shrubs. So we have that data from, point line intercept kind of stuff, and other functional groups in the understory, litter cover and depth, canopy cover. And we're also noting the distance to the closest live seed tree in each of these plots. So I mentioned that this is kind of a mix of data between stuff that Mark Meyer has done in the past and that we're incorporating, and things that my crew is doing over the past couple of summers and will continue to do next summer. These are the fires that we have data for so far. I have them listed going from the south to the north to just give you an idea of the spatial array of these fires. The year of the fire is listed after the fire name. And then the number of years after the fire, when that data was taken in these tree regeneration plots, is on the y-axis. And so something to note here is that, this isn't a consistent going 5 years after fire and take tree seedling data. It's kind of variable. But like I said, Eastern Sierra tree regen data is hard to come by. So we figured we're going to try and incorporate it into our analyses. And I also have this color-coded, the more brown red color are fires from the Inyo National Forest, and then the blue-green color is the Humboldt-Toyobe National Forest up near us in Reno. Okay, so digging into the data, this is sort of a messy plot, but I'll break it down. So these are the different fires, and this is the yellow pine density seedlings per hectare that we found on average in different severity levels. So unchanged, low severity, moderate, and then high in that darker color. And so you can see that there's differences between the fires, and there's differences between severities, with the Washington fire having some really standout plots. We had a bunch of outliers with thousands of yellow pine seedlings. And so that's why that fire looks like that. But a super basic statistical model, GLM, looking at the influence of both fire severity and using fire as a fixed effect, because we expect differences between these fires, shows that we do see a fire severity effect where we have more yellow pine seedlings coming in low and moderate severity fire than in high severity fire. And there are these differences between fires in the numbers of seedlings that are coming in. And so we wanted to explore that data in a more mechanistic fashion, asking which of these abiotic and biotic variables are really driving that pattern. So folks that have worked with tree regeneration data know that it's zero inflated. So you just have a lot of plots where you have zeros. And this makes it kind of hard to analyze. And so we're taking for now this, and I'm open to suggestion, this hurdle model approach, where first we're asking where just are there presences, where do we have at least one yellow pine seedling versus none? So this is a presence absence kind of question. And the second one is when there are at least, when we do have at least one seedling in the plot, what factors do we see most affecting yellow pine density? So just to get at the presence absence level of this, I can go through the model fitting process. We've tried a bunch of different stuff, but for now we have a model where we're looking at burn severity, climatic water deficit in the 5 years after fire. Live basal area, so this is the basal area of remaining live trees, any species in the plot. The closest live jeffrey pine for that seed source. And then in this model, we included an interaction effect between climate water deficit and live basal area. And so we tend to get, for people who are into stats, you can look at the estimates and the standard errors, but generally speaking, you tend to get more yellow pine seedlings in low and moderate severity fire and more mesic sites. So those are your wetter sites. And then when you're closer to seed source. And so this is nothing super surprising, and it matches what we see in other forests, especially arid forests. And when we break this out by the different variables, so we see the predicted probability of finding a yellow pine seedling. Burn severity did pull out in this, but we didn't see significance between the groups in post hoc analysis. And I have a theory on that. We do see a large effect of the closest live jeffrey pine. So the farther your seed source is away, the fewer seedlings you have in your plot. And then this was the more interesting piece to me, was this interaction effect. And interaction effects are always like hard to wrap your brain around. So this is looking at the interaction of climate water deficit, which is a measure of aridity in our plots, and then live basal area. So the amount of canopy cover we have from live trees left over. And so what this shows us is when we have really low live basal area. And so these different colored lines are different binned groupings for climate water deficit. Low climate water deficit means that it's a wetter site, so more mesic. Moderate, and then high climate water deficit. It's always a little bit of a brain tease, but when you have high climate water deficit, that means you don't have enough water to be a tree in that plot, right? So that's where it's harder and it's more arid. So when you have not a lot of shade in your plot, so no buffering of that hot sun, the seedlings are more likely to come in more mesic conditions, and a lot less likely to come in when you have high climate water deficits. And then when we move to a lot of shade from our trees, the climate water deficit part of the equation just becomes less important. And so how mesic or arid your site is not as important as just having those shade trees, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay, so what determines the density of yellow pines in plots that actually have tree seedlings after fire? And so we used a similar linear mixed effects model. We looked at burn severity, climate water deficit, the closest live jeffrey pine, and the total live basal area again for this model. And similarly, we see an effect of burn severity on how many yellow pine seedlings we have coming in, with more of them coming in the low and moderate severity fires than in the high severity fires or unchanged areas. And although there is a lot of variability in that, and then the closest live jeffrey pine, or your seed source, once again coming into play with fewer tree seedlings coming in when your seed tree is really far out. And so I think the reason why there's these high error bars around fire severity in these models is because fire severity in and of itself doesn't actually affect your tree seedlings. It's how it interacts with all your other variables, right? And so I'm trying to move away from using these generalized linear models to structural equation models. And like the stats of it isn't that important, but the reason why I like these is because you can get a more mechanistic look at really what is it about fire severity? Is it that it's affecting live basal area and you really want that canopy shade? Is it that it's all about the seed tree? And then you can look at interactions with some of the abiotic variables like climate water deficit and pull out the direct effects on yellow pine region, and then the indirect effects as well. And so I think this is a nice mechanistic way to think about what are those things that we're really looking for when we think of places where we're going to get natural regen of our jeffrey pine, ponderosa pines after fire. So this is kind of what we're moving towards. Hopefully I'll give this talk again in a year and I'll have a more mechanistic kind of framework for how to think about this. So just to sum up the tree regeneration side of things, high severity fires have the lowest regeneration. Again, this is nothing new. Important factors in post-fire regen for yellow pines are climate water deficit, the basal area of the live trees and that shade, and the distance to the nearest seed tree. And particularly in our more arid sites, it's important to have that canopy shade left behind. And this is probably why those high severity fire sites aren't getting, they may be getting seed into those zones, but it might not be going anywhere. And I think most factors seem to link back to fire severity, and what those linkages are, I think, can be really informative for how we think about how these changing fire regimes and changing climates are going to play out in terms of tree regeneration in the future. Okay, so moving on to tree-shrub interactions. What role do shrubs play in post-fire tree regeneration? I'm sure you guys gathered from my introductory material that I don't hate on shrubs as much as some folks do. And in fact, I am technically a rangeland scientist, so I'm definitely coming at this from a different perspective. So let's see where it goes. We are using the same plot level data for each of the tree seedlings that we found in our plots. We noted whether it was under or in the drip line of a shrub or not. And we also, again, since we have understory data for the entire plot, we have % cover of shrubs in each plot. And so one way to think about whether trees are associating with shrubs is to use an electivity index. So this simply takes into account the % of seedlings that you find under shrubs and then the shrub cover that you have in that plot, right? Because if you have no shrub cover, then there's no expectation to find tree seedlings under shrubs. And if you have 100% shrub cover, that's going to bias things as well. So you have to take into account both when thinking about whether or not your trees are actively associating with shrubs. So this ends up in a number that goes between -1 and 1. And because I am not the kind of person who can look at a mathematical function and just understand what it's doing, we tried to map this out using just data that we created at different levels of both shrub cover and different amounts of percentage, like proportion of seedlings that you find under shrubs. And so what you can see here is that this top line of dots, see if I can get my cursor over on this screen. This top line of dots is where we have 90% of our seedlings showing up under shrubs. So that's most of our seedlings are under shrubs. And then that x-axis goes from 0% shrub cover to really high shrub cover. And then our electivity index on the y-axis, if the number is greater than 0, trees are associating with shrubs more often than we expect by chance. And if it's less than, and so this suggests facilitation essentially. And so down here, we see that if the number is less than 0, trees are associating with shrubs less often than expected by chance. And so, for example, if 90% of our seedlings are under shrubs, but we don't have a lot of shrub cover, that's a really high score. And that suggests that there's a lot of facilitation going on, right? And so it just helps me to think about how these functions kind of behave. So what did we find? We calculated the average electivity index across the fires for which we had both % cover data and this sort of microhabitat. Was the tree found under a shrub or not? And this is where we sit. The rangeland scientist was disappointed to see that trees generally are associating with shrubs less often than expected by chance. So my nurse shrub idea is not really playing out, at least in this natural regeneration post-fire survey data. And so for most of these fires down on the Inyo, and again, I have all of these figures, the fires are listed from more south to more north. So the Inyo fires, like definitely veering towards competitive interactions. And then as we get up into the Humboldt-Toyabe, we see a little bit more movement towards the facilitation end of things, though not very convincing, right? So in just thinking about like, what is it that causes such differences between the fires? The first thing, I thought of, and others have said as well, is well, what are your species of shrubs that come in after these fires? These are all really different sites and they have different species components. And so this figure shows shrub species. I've got the 6-letter codes, and I don't expect people to, match them up by eye. But I just want to point out our big players here that I think are important. So this color, the kind of green chartreuse color, this is Ceavel or Ceanothus velutinus. And this tends to be the shrub that we most often see up north in the Humboldt-Toyabe and the sites that we are most often working in with this Ceanothus shrub. And then this blue color is Persia tridentata, which is a whole different beast, right? It's antelope bitterbrush. It tends to be in more arid sites. And this is in those more southerly fires, which I think are just more arid regions. And so things might play out differently down there. And so this is something we're going to be exploring, is the role of the shrub species and also the abiotic components of these different sites. So if you remember, the stress gradient hypothesis said in more stressful habitats, we expect more facilitation. So we can look at that with our data as well. And we've started doing that a little bit. But one thing that, you know, we're dealing with here is that not only are our sites very different from an abiotic standpoint, from the different shrub species that they have, but we also went into these fires at different time points after fire. And each of these sort of tree regeneration stories has a chance element or a stochastic element where you have to think about, you know, within the first 2 to 3 years after fire, was there a mass event? And then did we see precipitation come in with that mass event to get trees at all in the first place? So there's just a lot of moving parts. And so this is why experiments are really nice, is because you can hold a lot of things constant and just ask the question you want to ask. And so this is Rosa Kirk-Davidoff. She's working on her master's at UNR. And so she's been doing this nurse plant experiment where we planted jeffrey pine under Ceanothus velutinus, and then in open spots where there was no shrub, and then in places where she clipped the shrub away. And so the reasoning for this is you get all of the soil differences, but none of the canopy shade or buffering from high and low temperatures that you would under an actual shrub. And one thing I want to point out here is this is about 2 years after the tamarack fire in this site, and these shrubs are not huge. You know, Ceanothus, it's a little spindly. You can see there's sun getting under there. This isn't like closed canopy kind of habitat that jeffrey pine typically doesn't like. So there's room to move under there. We have 4 different sites that we instigated this at. She planted in these, we call them triads. So the X's are the seedlings, and there's one that's under a shrub, there's one that's under a removed shrub, and there's one in the inner space, all within, you know, a pretty tight area. And we replicated this across 4 different sites, planting about 480 seedlings. We planted in November of 2024, and our last sampling date was last month. So we have about a year's worth of data. And so when we look at this from an experimental perspective, we can see that seedlings with nurse plants had the highest survival. So this is the probability of survival for our little jeffrey pines. And you can see that it's higher when it's under a shrub in the green than when the shrubs are clipped away, and in the inner spaces. And so this is just averaged across the whole time period. Yeah, I mean, so I think this kind of speaks for itself that we can see facilitative effects in shrubs, and why it's not showing up in the natural regen data. I think it can be pretty site specific. Looking at our survival over time. So this is, again, the probability of survival by our jeffrey pine seedlings in different months. And I don't have the actual names of the months. I have the numbers of the months along the x-axis there, but you can see that May to June, the mortality is pretty low. And then once we hit July, August, September, this is when we really start seeing greater mortality kicking in of the seedlings. And that's when those lines really start separating between the colors, and the ones that are under shrubs kind of pulling away as being in a higher bucket of survival probability than the other treatment groups. And so this is where in our kind of Mediterranean climate, where we have most of our precipitation coming in the winter months and then hanging out in snowpack and melting off through the spring, those July through September months are when we're at the driest and when we're at the hottest. And it's definitely the harshest time for these seedlings. Rosa also had data loggers. So she was monitoring soil temperatures in each of the different treatment types and soil moisture. And so this plot just shows mean soil temperature in August. This is a time of year where it is very hot. And you can see that soil temperatures tend to be quite a bit lower if the data logger or if the sensor is under a shrub than if it's in either of the open areas, the clipped away shrub or the interspace. And so it's possible that just by buffering from those really hot temperatures, those trees are faring a little bit better. She also looked at soil moisture. So this shows soil moisture. And here we split it out by site. And the reasoning for this is there's a higher difference in soil moisture between the sites than there is between the treatments. So some of our sites are just drier than others. And this can come into play when thinking about whether or not we see this sort of facilitative effect. And so there was this mild difference where soil water content under shrubs in the green was a bit higher than in the clipped area or in the interspace area. But again, the differences between sites was actually a little bit more dramatic. And so she's still digging into this data, and she'll hopefully be defending her thesis in the spring. All right, so to summarize this section of the talk about tree-shrub interactions, they veer more towards competitive than facilitative in our post-fire survey data, but our northern fires have some signal for facilitation, and I'm trying to wrap my head around that a little bit. Our planted Jeffrey pines show increased survival under Ceanothus velutinus shrubs, and shrub benefits may come from these lower soil temperatures and slightly more moisture under the shrubs than out in the open. Yeah, so yeah, okay, I have plenty of time. I didn't know if I was going to get to the invasive plant stuff. So under what conditions do we see cheatgrass and other invaders coming in after fire? We are using the same plot level data. And again, some of this data came from Mark Meyer's group, and they don't have data on all invasive species. They only have data for cheatgrass. So for our CAL FIRE post-fire monitoring plots, which is from the Tamarack, Dexter, Washington, and Boot fires, we have presence absence of all invasive species across those fires. So for the people who are really into non-native species, I'm going to just show a list of everything we found in the next slide. And that comes from those fires. And then we also have percent cover of cheatgrass from these fires. Whereas from the Inyo National Forest plots, we just have presence absence of cheatgrass. So just something to keep in mind that there's slightly different data streams going on here. So what invasive species did we find in our plots? I guess I shouldn't say invasive, non-native species did we find in our plots. So I have the scientific name, the common name, the functional group that it belongs to, and all of the grasses are in that green shading color. And then the forbs are in that blue shading color. And then the final column is the percent of the plots that they were found in across our monitoring sites with going from where the species we found the most to the species we found the least. And so 53% of our plots had cheatgrass in it. And the other big players seem to be prickly lettuce and yellow salsify and mullein. And after that, it gets to lower probability of finding them in our plots, all the way down to things that were quite rare. And I'm sure we missed species that were very rare because we only have so many monitoring plots put in. Digging into just the cheatgrass data, which we have from across more of the fires. Again, these are the different fires we're looking at that we have data for, and they're listed along the x-axis from south going to north. And this is the percent of plots that had Bromus tectorum cheatgrass present in them at different burn severities. So unburned, low severity, moderate, and high. And the first thing that jumps out at me with this is that the Inyo National Forest, like down south, they just don't have the cheatgrass problem that we seem to have up in our northern areas. And so I've been talking to Mark a little bit about this, and we have some ideas. And I think mostly, though, it has to do with the degree to which these fires took place in sites that are more removed from places where people recreate. And that, you know, just that human factor of bringing in seeds plays a large role probably in where we find cheatgrass coming in. So we wanted to use the percent cover data we had from some of our fires to ask what determines how much cheatgrass is coming in after fire. So this is a statistical model from just using the data from the Butte, Washington and Tamarack fires. You know, again, I tend not to go through like the model fitting process, but our top model had native perennial grass cover, which is well known to be something that keeps cheatgrass out in the Great Basin, shrub cover, dead tree like the percent of dead trees that were dead in the plot, which we're using as a proxy for fire severity in this case, because this model, we only can use continuous data with it. Excuse me, climate water deficit and minimum temperature. And the things that came out as significant are in bold here. So shrub cover, dead tree percent, which is again our fire severity proxy, and then post-fire climatic water deficit. And going through these three significant variables one by one, not surprisingly, from things that we know from the Great Basin, we have the dead tree basal area on the x-axis. So again, this is our proxy for severity. The more basal area you have, the higher severity fire it was, and you get more cheatgrass when you have higher severity fire. And these are things that we sort of know already from our Great Basin ecosystems. For climate water deficit, this one's a little weird. We saw that more arid areas had a little more cheatgrass, but this is sort of a weak relationship, and probably, I mean, just to be like brutally honest, we shouldn't be using linear models here. It should be some kind of curve. And so we're still figuring this one out. But I think an interesting one is shrub cover. Shrub cover here is along the x-axis, and then bromus tectora cover on the y. And so basically, as you have more shrubs in your plots, you have less cheatgrass. And so I think this speaks to competition. Yeah, shrubs are competition for trees, but they're also competition for things we don't want. And I think that's something that's important to keep in the back of our minds as we see these fires becoming larger and higher severity, and the possibility of cheatgrass moving into the Eastern Sierra and creating grass fire cycles. You know, what's worse? Is it your shrubs or is it cheatgrass? So just sort of management things to think about as we look at post-fire management and things like reseeding and mastication. So the invasive species summary for this talk is that there is variable cheatgrass invasion after fire in the Eastern Sierra, with more coming in these northern post-fire sites. And this photo that I have on the right is from a hike that I just took like a couple weeks ago on a really popular trail outside of Reno in the Humboldt-Toyabe. And you're looking down on a south-facing slope that I think had been mountain mahogany and some shrubs underneath, and is now just filled with cheatgrass. And then you can see not too far off in the distant north-facing slope is our nice Jeffreyi pine forest. So yeah, I would say this is not the ecosystem we want to see after fire. High severity fires with low shrub cover are most at risk for cheatgrass invasion. And that is all I have for today. So with that, I would like to thank the Forest Service and CAL FIRE. Becky Weeman helped with a lot of the spatial analysis and plot selection. So we random stratified our plots across fire severity and heat load, and she helped with that process. And then our crew, who has been amazing 2 summers in a row, and we're hoping for a great next summer as well. And I guess now I can answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing this research with us. I'm very curious to see how it all ends up as you finish this study, and hope that we get to have you back and see the final results when they're available. So with that, we will transition over to question and answer. I can already see lots of applause coming in the little icons, but just thank you again so much for presenting with us. I'm going to end the recording and we'll switch over to Q&A in just a second here.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, go ahead. You can always pull it up if people ask about something in particular.